Once, many years ago, in a small village in Poland, the rabbi's only son was engaged to be married. And in preparation for the wedding of the rabbi's son, the mayor of the town instructed that a huge barrel be built in the town square. And during the weeks leading up to the wedding, everyone in the village was to fill a pail with the absolute best wine that they had in their wine cellar. And then they were to pour that pail into the bucket, into the barrel, the big barrel. And if everyone in town brought their best wine to the barrel, then on the evening of the wedding, the bride and the groom and all of their guests would have the sweetest, most wonderful wine that anyone had ever tasted. And over the next few weeks, hour after hour, day after day, a procession of villagers carried their buckets into the town square, and they poured them into the barrel until finally, on the day of the wedding, the day everyone had been waiting for, the barrel was filled all the way up to the top. And after the wedding ceremony had concluded and everyone shouted, "Mazel Tov," the villagers all gravitated towards that giant barrel. They were excited, and they were ready to fill their wine glasses with the richest, sweetest wine that anyone had ever tasted. And the mayor of the village was the first one to place his glass under the spigot, and the entire village fell silent as he turned the knob, and the liquid poured out. And the villagers were astonished to see that what flowed forth from the barrel was not the dark red wine that everyone was expecting, but rather what flowed forth from that barrel was water. In fact, the entire barrel was filled with nothing but water. And the villagers all lowered their eyes in shame, because during the days and weeks leading up to the wedding, every single villager thought that they could get away with pouring a pail of water and not wine into that barrel. What would it matter if I poured a pail of water into the barrel, they thought? After all, everyone else is pouring wine. Who's even going to notice? Each and every villager expected the other villagers to do their part while they did nothing at all. Each and every villager put their own needs before the collective needs of the community. In this week's double parasha, Matot Maseh, the leaders of the tribes of Reuben and Gad approach Moses and tell him that they actually don't want to settle in the land of Israel. They've wandered for long enough, and the land that they are currently sitting on, land that was on the east side of the Jordan River, that land is more than good enough. Vayamru im matzanu chen be'einecha yutan et ha'aretz hazot le'avadecha le'achuzah al ta'avirenu et ha'yarden. If we have found favor in your eyes, they say, give us this land. This is good cattle country. We have lots of cattle. Give us this land here. Don't force us to cross the Jordan into the land of Israel. Well, as you might expect, Moses is enraged by this. Ha'achichem yavo lamilchama ve'atem teshvu po. Moses says, your brothers are going to war. They're going to settle the land that God promised us, and you're going to sit here? You're going to put your own needs, your own desires, your own well-being before the well-being of your community? How selfish can you be? To which the Reubenites and the Gadites reply, good point, Moses. Okay, we'll help our brothers defeat the Canaanites and conquer the land of Israel, but then we are going to cross the Jordan again and return to this land east of the Jordan River and settle not there in the land of Israel, but right here. And Moses agrees to that compromise, and that's exactly what happens. But that's not the end of the story. The rabbis teach that the tribes of Reuben and Gad violated the key communal principle that has bound the Jewish people together for millennia. Al tifrosh min hatzibor. Don't separate yourself from your community. And because they settled east of the Jordan River, that's precisely what the tribes of Reuben and Gad did. They separated themselves from their people. They cherished their cattle and their property more than the lives of their fellow Israelites, and because they put their own needs before the collective needs of the community, those two tribes were punished accordingly. Our tradition teaches that when the Assyrians attacked the kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, the tribes of Reuben and Gad were the first two tribes to be sent into exile as punishment for putting their own needs before the well-being of their people. The rabbis equate the Reubenites and the Gadites to Korach, the demagogue, to Bilam, the soothsayer, and even to Goliath, the arch enemy of the Jewish people. And tragically, this week, we saw the sin of Reuben and Gad play out in real time in our own American Jewish community. Many of you may have read about the terrible embezzlement scandal that came to light this past week on Long Island. A man named David Ostrov, the former chief financial officer of the Schechter School of Long Island, which is a conservative Jewish day school that has an elementary school and a middle school and a high school, essentially the Long Island equivalent of Golda Academy. This man was indicted on charges that he stole over $8 million from the school during his 11 years of employment there. And he used that money to buy a 1965 Mustang convertible, and he bought 5 houses on Fire Island, and he bought a very impressive collection of rare sports memorabilia. And he did all of that at the expense of a loving and trusting Jewish institution. As the Schechter School said in the statement that they released this past week about the scandal, this individual is accused of a systematic, sophisticated, and carefully contrived fraud on a chilling scale. And if convicted, he would be guilty of something beyond the theft of cash. He would be guilty of the destruction of trust. Just like Reuben and Gad, David Ostrov cared only for his own needs, his own personal gain. And he clearly had no compunction about destroying innocent people's lives in the service of gaining more for himself. And just like the Reubenites and the Gadites, he too will now be held accountable. But the difficult truth is, we're all selfish by nature. None of us are really ever that far away from potentially becoming the Reubenites or the Gadites, or even, God forbid, like David Ostrov. In fact, we're biologically programmed to look out for ourselves. The great evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins has famously argued that human beings are genetically hardwired to be selfish. It's a survival mechanism that has allowed us to survive and evolve for millions of years. And although we may be biologically programmed that way, Dawkins says that the ultimate goal of human society is really, at the end of the day, to overcome the selfishness that lies at our genetic core. As he writes in his classic book, The Selfish Gene, a human society based simply on the gene's laws of universal ruthless selfishness would be a very nasty society in which to live. We should strive to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly towards a common good. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. And although Dawkins is very famously a militant atheist, I think he provides a wonderful definition of what it means to be Jewish here. Being Jewish means building a society in which people cooperate generously and work unselfishly towards a common good. To paraphrase the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, being Jewish means striving to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people, not only achieving the greatest good for yourself. But just to play devil's advocate for a minute, I want to remind us that it is okay to be a self-advocate. In fact, the Torah encourages us to advocate for ourselves. As we read in last week's parasha, the daughters of Slofchad advocated to receive their rightful inheritance when their father died. But when self-advocacy becomes selfishness, when it becomes self-serving, when it leads to separation from your community, as it did with the tribes of Reuben and Gad, that is when it crosses the line. In the immortal words of our sage Hillel, Im eina nili mili, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? Uchshe'ani le'atzmi, ma'ani. But if I am only for myself, then what am I? Amen. We continue now on page 428, followed by the Musaf Amidan, page 430. Please rise.
Yitkadah, Yitkadah, Shemei Rabbah, Yolmadi Prakru Dev Yamlich Malchuteh.